On my first slide here, I have Deuteronomy 16:18, and I want to just read this little portion for you and make a couple of comments about it. It says in Deuteronomy 16:18, "You shall appoint for yourself judges and officers in all your towns, which Jehovah your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not distort justice, you shall not be partial, and you shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. Justice, and only justice, you shall pursue, so that you may live and possess the land which Jehovah your God is giving you. You shall not plant for yourselves an Asherah of any kind of tree beside the altar of Jehovah your God, which you shall make for yourselves. You shall not set up for yourselves a sacred pillar, which Jehovah your God hates." Now, I just want to say a couple of things about that little section there. Number one, this is where this Torah portion is coming from. The word Shoftim is in there. It's translated as judges. So when you see judges, that is the Hebrew word Shoftim. And the officers are shoter. They're obviously, as you can tell, really kind of connected. And so what you'll notice here is that we have judges, shoftim, which are appointed by the leaders. We don't have any kind of democracy going on here. It seems, according to tradition, it's not outlined real clearly in the Torah regarding exactly how this is supposed to happen, but we have a series of, already we know that we have 70 leaders, 70 elders of the tribes who have been appointed to leadership positions. Now it is their job to appoint judges who will hear cases. And of course, we know that Yehovah told Moshe previously, if there's something too hard for your judges, they will bring it to the temple, to the high priest or the judge that is in those days to answer your questions. So that's what we're dealing with here, is setting up a system of government, essentially. We have shoftim, judges, and shoter, officers, which would basically be enforcers, police officers. And you can see also, and this might be instructive for you, you just make a note to yourself that the first mention of shoftim is in Genesis 16:5, where Sarah says to Abram, "May Yehovah judge between you and me." That was when she was unhappy how Hagar was starting to act up, and Sarah got angry and said, "You did this." So yeah, that was a difficult situation for her to be in, but that was the first mention of the word shoftim. May Yehovah judge between us. And then the first mention of enforcers or officers, shoter, is in Exodus 5:6, and this is where Pharaoh delegates the hard labor to the overseers. So the overseers of Egypt were the first mention of these shoter, these enforcers. Now, I brought to your attention that the leadership, the existing leadership of 70 elders, maybe it's the top, a couple of guys from each tribe, it is their responsibility to appoint judges. These judges should be men of known quality. They should have a reputation for righteousness and impartiality. Now, this is interesting to me that God gave these people the ability. It left it entirely into their hands to actually put together a leadership structure. What that says to me is a couple of things. That because he left it to their free will to select their own people, not through an election, of course, but through an appointment, that because their free will was enacted, the officers and the judges are almost always going to reflect the spiritual quality of the nation. When you appoint your own leaders, just like in this nation, when you appoint your own leaders to lead you, you're going to be going in the direction that you intend to go. The leadership is always going to reflect the people, so to speak. Now, in our country, the leadership is going to reflect what we ourselves have placed into positions of authority over us. In the case of the Hebrews, it's a little bit different. It's top down. It's not bottom up. It's more top down. And so I think you can see that either way, it's challenging for the Israelites because the people may be of a certain mind and they don't really have a say in who their leaders are. Those leaders were, selected from a long time ago, and they are going to be in place until other leaders replace them, and the people aren't going to have a whole lot of say in that. But you can see in Yuvah's word as you go through the prophets that the leadership of Israel is always getting called onto the carpet. And I think that having an understanding of how this works really help you to understand that a little bit better. That the leadership is going to bear the brunt because they have responsibility for the whole nation. Whereas in America, we're electing our own people. And you know what? That's kind of bad for us because we elect the people we want. And so it's not like we, the people down here on the totem pole, can say, it wasn't really us. We had wicked leaders who were leading us astray. That's not really going to fly here in America because we elect our own leaders. And so our leaders are going to reflect our own desires, which that's not a good thing, especially, when judgment comes. And I think you can see judgment happening right now. Everybody's held responsible because everybody's involved. But in Israel, the leadership is already in place, and the common man doesn't really have much to say about it. And so the poor people, the normal people of the land might have received a measure of grace and mercy that perhaps we won't receive because of the way our system works. Does anybody have any comments or questions about that? Do you agree, or do you have an issue with that?
Affirmative.
Who said that?
Wayne and Marie.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, we see that too.
Yeah. Unfortunately, yeah. So I think this is also, part of the reason that you see James in the book of James saying to his readers that those of us who are teachers or leaders will bear a stricter judgment. So in his nation, that was undoubtedly truer than it is in our nation. So the nation's going to be based on the judges of the higher orders. And so, everybody's getting judged, but I think maybe the Israelites got a little bit more leeway than we might have. Now, back to that slide there, you notice that it says justice and only justice shall you observe, shall you pursue. Now, I think whenever you see those, whenever you see in two, right next to each other, a duplication of words, and that happens a couple of times in these Torah portions that we're taking a look at. I mean, first it says, justice you shall pursue. But I don't think that what we're looking at here is emphasis. I don't personally believe that when the Bible repeats the same word twice, that it is for emphasis.
Are you talking about verse 20?
Yes. Zedek, righteousness, righteousness. Your Bible will translate that in various ways. Mine was the NASB. It said justice and only justice. You can see on my slide that and only are italicized, giving you a clear indication that is italicized because those words are not in the text. What are you saying, Angela?
That which is altogether just.
Yeah, your translation is saying that which is altogether just. So I think whenever you see words duplicated in your Bible, it is not for emphasis. That's just my opinion. A lot of people think it is for emphasis. Can it be used for emphasis? Sure, but I don't know that was the intent. When you see justice and only justice, or when you see right at the beginning of verse 20, justice you shall pursue, what do you think of? Do you think it's just giving us emphasis? Oh, really, really pursue justice. Do you think that's what it's saying? How would you interpret that?
Well,
were saying about how it isn't just emphasis, or may not be at all, but I think that it's just ways and continuing that process, like the due process of it.
Yes.
I think there's example. I'm trying to think of a good example of what I'm trying to get at there, but
No, I think I know. Yeah.
How do you do it too? You know,
Yes.
you might come out with the right answer, but how do you get there?
Right.
So.
Yes. No, I think that's just one level of it, and that's a great insight. That's a great insight, Carla. It matters how you pursue justice, and it matters that the punishment fits the crime. There are so many different elements to this. You cannot pursue righteousness in an unrighteous manner. You know, like in our day, I think a good example, it's a pretty cheesy one, but, you know, a police officer setting up a entrapment, what you might call entrapment in law enforcement, like a speed trap or, you know, something where you wouldn't normally have committed the crime, but the police actually kind of suckered you into committing the crime when you wouldn't have otherwise. That's not pursuing righteousness in a righteous way. And also, you know, pursuing righteousness in righteousness means making sure that that this is the principle of lex talionis, which is an eye for an eye, which means that the punishment must fit the crime. And we deal with that so many different times in this two Torah portions about how we're going to pursue righteousness in a righteous way. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention because I think that's pretty critical.
Well, also what Carla said about due process. When I was a teacher, I mean, you know the kid did it, but you can't do that. You've got to give them due process. You just have to. Right.
And I think, you know, here is a perfect example, and I don't know why I didn't think of this before. We're dealing with, in our own nation right now, people overreacting, dramatically reacting to one witness. You know that we've talked about this on a few occasions, and everybody thinks, well, this is a perfect witness. It's a camera. No, that is not the truth. That is a really clear representation of part of the truth, but we don't have the whole story. When you see somebody lifts up their cell phone and starts filming something, you have no idea what happened to lead you up to that place. You have no idea what happened after the camera stopped, but primarily what happened before the camera started rolling. And we're all starting to respond to the one witness. And that's not, you cannot judge by one witness, and that's not even a complete witness. Tracy?
This is just kind of a little silly example, but there was this royalty guy, I don't know, but he was, someone took a picture of him, and I think he was doing this with one finger, like saying number one or something like that. Well, from a different angle, it looked like he was flipping off camera. And so, I mean, and it really looks like it. And so it's like, this is your one witness here, and surely that can't be a lie. But when you flip to this camera, you can see which finger it actually was.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a good point. The camera doesn't lie. Yes, it does. Or you can make it tell the story you want to tell. You know, take it from me. I'm a camera guy. So that's what I do. We edit it together to tell the story we want you to see. We position the camera in a certain way so that it looks a certain way in a different light. We cannot judge. And, I actually found myself doing that this week. I saw something on some video, and my blood pressure went up slightly, and I thought, oh, you dork. You're doing exactly what everyone else is doing, responding to something without context. And so I pledged to turn it off, not looking, don't care. We'll find out later. But, we as a society have come around to this point where it's like we're just willing to take one camera perspective. And I don't care, you may say, well, man, we've got cameras in 5 different positions. We can see what happened from 5 different positions. That's great, but it still doesn't tell you what happened before those cameras started rolling. Context is everything, and why something is happening, and what led up to it, and who did what, and who said what. You don't have
And
all that information.
That's the due process part, that everyone's reacting before they actually ask these people questions that need to be answered.
Absolutely. Yeah,
You have to give a person an opportunity to explain themselves before you react.
Yeah, I think you are seeing really clearly in our country right now just an absolute lack of due process. We are not pursuing righteousness in righteousness. We're not pursuing righteousness with righteousness. We're looking for excuses to do things the way we want to do them. We are reaping some terrible whirlwinds that we have sown for ourselves, and it's not going to be pretty, but we deserve it, unfortunately. Kevin?
Hey everybody, glad to be here. Good to see everyone again. The interesting part of it to me, you mentioned it also, you shall not distort justice. I think there is a major distortion with regard to individual perspective, and I think that's another thing that's kind of being amplified in our current climate. Yep. Everybody's perspective has some element of truth now, where if it's actually true, then it's actually true. Just because you think that it's actually true doesn't necessarily mean that your perspective is right.
Yeah.
So what we're going off of is my perspective, even of this camera scene or video that I'm seeing. From my perspective, this is right, or from my perspective, this is wrong. Let me get a mom behind me to believe it.
Yeah.
That's not justice.
No, that is not justice at all. That's chaos, and we're seeing it. Right. It's real clearly chaos. So, no, I appreciate that, Kevin. That's an excellent point. Now, I think what's curious to me, and I want to bring your attention to this, and that is the next little section that I underlined there in verse 21. It says, "You shall not plant for yourself an Asherah of any kind of tree beside the altar." Why, in the midst of this discussion of righteousness and justice, is he talking about Asherah or Asherim?
You have an answer?
I have an idea.
Oh, good.
I have an idea. But, I'll just say, if you don't know, an Asherah, nobody actually even knows what they are. I think most people are assuming that it is something made out of wood, and wood doesn't last as long as stone. And so that's why we haven't found any Asherah or Asherim through the ancient world.
Sort of
it's some kind of a totem pole, some type of a tree that people are worshiping as some type of a fertility thing. Nobody's really certain what an Asherah is. But I'm curious to know your opinion about why he gives us an instruction regarding not having an Asherah when we're talking about completely different things. How do you think that adds together? Mikey, do you want to share something?
I don't know that I have any ideas on that one. I think the first use of it is regarding pagan altars.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's in Exodus. Take a look real quick, sorry.
No, that's all good. Asherah.
It's that word. It's also translated as grove.
Yeah.
Right?
Exodus
Here I have sacred trees or poles set up near an altar.
Right. So the first instance, I believe, is Exodus 34.
Yeah. But you shall destroy their altars, break their images, and cut down their Asherah.
Right. So does anyone have any idea about why that might be referenced here? It seems oddly out of place. Tracy?
I was going to say what Kevin just said about them being placed next to an altar.
Yeah, I think they were traditionally near an altar, but also it's talking about here, at least in Blue Letter Bible, is her image. So it's kind of like putting the image of somebody else or the image of a false god near the altar, which could be, kind of two things that go hand in hand. Traditionally, these things go near an altar, but then also you're talking about the image of a goddess.
Yes. So I totally agree with that. Tracy, continue your thought.
I was just going to say that it's this mixing thing, like we see with everything else, don't do those things for me. Don't mix it with me. See how they're doing it. don't do those things for me. But
Yeah.
that's
No, I think that's a perfect corollary that you're pointing out there, Tracy, and I'll tell you why I think it's mentioned here. Because if you're mixing, I don't want to say mixing your worship, because I don't think this has anything to do with worship. I think that what you're looking at is an alternate system, an alternate way of looking at things, and you're going to confuse yourself. If you've got different law codes or different ideas about the way things should be done, then mixing religions, for example, is going to create more unrighteousness, because the way of Asherah may be, and probably is, very different than the righteousness that you can pursue by following Yehovah. These gods, if you want to put it that way, are completely antithetical to each other. They have nothing in common. And so your judgment is going to be seriously skewed by mixing idolatry in with your worship and your understanding of who Yehovah is and how he wants you to worship him and how he wants you to conduct yourself in society. So you're going to get mixed messages, and you're going to end up seriously confused, and you're not going to be able to pursue righteousness because your mind's going to be in a jumble regarding what is the right thing.
Okay, that's kind of what's happened. He says before this, pursue righteous in a righteous way, and he defines what righteous is. Mm-hmm. Don't blend in what they say righteousness is, or you lose sight of what truth is, which we were just talking about.
Yes.
Okay.
That's my interpretation. That's my understanding. You may have a different idea, and I'm delighted to hear it.
Compromise.
Yeah, I think
I also think within our traditions that we've adopted, you end up with a certain sense of normalcy. Like, for example, this tradition is normal. Mm-hmm. We can put this tree next to the altar because it's decorative or it's whatever, but ultimately it's not really that. It's actually something that you're combining with the true and holy God. Right?
Yep.
But we create that normalcy with these traditions that we have.
Absolutely.
There's normal things that we should do. It's okay for us to do it.
Yep, absolutely. Great insight. That's a good topic for further study, further discussion, because I think we seriously get ourselves mixed up, not just in the worship of Yehovah, but in our minds, in our societies, in our pursuit of justice, in our pursuit of justice among our family, justice with our children. If we get wrapped up in other worship systems, the world's system of doing things, the world's idea of what's right and wrong, we're going to get seriously confused, and we're not going to be able to pursue justice. We're just not.
Not in a just way.
Not in a just way, right. Or we may have a skewed way of seeing justice, or we may have a skewed way of getting to the point that we think is justice.
But then we each have our own version of justice.
It's exactly right.
And we end up fighting with each other.
Exactly. Tracy?
And just to kind of tag on to what Angie just said, is I'm reading it in the Hebrew, that right before verse 20, where it says, don't take a bribe, a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. Mm-hmm. The Hebrew, I'm not sure what your translation says, but the Hebrew says, and perverts my words of righteousness, which I think makes a big difference.
Divrei. I don't know whether that's the words or
it's
my words.
The
my word,
yod at the end
my
is
words.
my.
Okay.
And righteousness is at a keem there, so it's just saying, like Andrew was saying about, my own righteousness, my own truth. Well, he's telling you, this is my righteousness, these are my words, and if you do these things, it's going to pervert my words. Mm-hmm. And so, and just like we're talking about with all these other things afterward about doing the things that other people do when it's not something that he said to do.
Right. Yep. Absolutely. It just confuses things. It creates a whole ball of confusion. Absolutely. I want to bring your attention to the next slide that I put up here for Deuteronomy. We're in Deuteronomy 17 now. And if you take a look at Deuteronomy 17:11, this is just another little section that I wanted to. It's kind of mid-thought, mid-sentence, so to speak. I'm going to back up just a wee bit and get a running start where it says, "And you shall take heed to do according to all that they instruct you." This is where you're talking about the people who have been appointed as your leaders. You must do what they tell you. Okay, so it says, you shall take heed to do according to all that they instruct you, according to the sentence of the law. I see that I've got that underlined. You might want to look at that in Hebrew. We're coming to it. According to the terms of the law, my translation says, which they teach you. And according to the verdict which they tell you, you shall do. You shall not turn aside from the word which they declare to you, to the right or to the left. The man who acts presumptuously by not listening to the priest who stands to serve Yehovah your God, nor to the judge, that man shall die. Thus you will purge the evil from Israel. Then all the people will hear and be afraid, and will not act presumptuously again. Now, I want to point out a couple of things. If you notice in that Hebrew there, it's quite interesting. What does it say, Angela?
For sentence?
According to the sentence of the Torah.
Hadavar. It's the word.
Yes, al pei haTorah. What is the word pei?
Mouth.
The mouth. According to the mouth of the Torah, which they shall teach. Yorucha. I think what's interesting here is that the common people need to recognize, and we need to recognize, that God has given authority for the specific purpose, and He's given it to whom He wills. We know, according to some of the New Testament passages, that God gives leadership positions to whom He will, and we, the common people, are responsible to follow them. And this is where things get a little bit dicey, okay? Because you have to know Yehovah's word, and you have to have His Spirit, and you have to figure out, how am I going to navigate this minefield of doing the will of God and yet submitting to authority? Because I want to point out to you that this is precisely so that lawlessness will not flourish. And that is exactly what we are seeing that is flourishing all around us, is people having zero respect for authority. And what we're seeing here is the mouth of the Torah. This is where the concept of the oral Torah comes from. This phrase right here. If you've heard this phrase, Torah shaval pei, this is the oral Torah. Now I want to bring to your attention a couple of interesting things. Notice that it says, we shall listen to the mouth of the Torah, which they will teach us, according to the verdict which they tell you, you shall do. Okay, now look at this next section from Matthew 23:1. Where Yeshua spoke to the crowds and said to His disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees are seated in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. And then Romans 13, we've got every person is to be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, for those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. Now, I know that this is really challenging, but did you notice that the words of Yeshua sound remarkably similar to the words from the Torah? Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe. But then he deviates and says, do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. Now, I know that this is a challenging portion, and a lot of people have been highly confused by this. And I know that there are some fanciful ways of interpreting this out there. And I know that Michael Rood has one of them. He has suggested that, when one of these Torah scholars or a Pharisee or something was sitting in the seat of Moses, that they could not say anything but the words of Moses. It's an interesting idea. There's zero historical accuracy to actually back that up, but it's an interesting idea. So it's interesting that Yeshua seems to be quoting this same passage from Deuteronomy 17:11, According to the word of the Torah which they teach you, and according to the verdict they tell you, you shall do. Interesting to compare those two things, and then yet when he goes off and says, but don't do what they do. Do what they tell you, but don't do what they do. Now, I know that, man, if you look up that passage in your standard Bible commentary, holy mackerel, they don't have any idea what to do with that. That is seriously confusing to a lot of people. And I don't know, but, Michael Rood's idea regarding how to interpret that, it's certainly interesting, but it's not backed up by any evidence. So, is Yeshua telling us to obey what the Pharisees and the scribes tell us to do? He certainly seems to, but is he talking about their traditions? Man, there's a lot of different interpretations about this scripture, and it's hard to deal with. Carla.
I think it's when they're reading the Torah, their mouth is speaking the truth, the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
But the Pharisees are notorious for putting their own words above Torah.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of twisting this to make it seem like they have more authority than the Torah.
Yeah.
And they make their additional rules. And that's what I think Matthew is referring to.
Yeah. That's a good insight, Carla. Thank you. This isn't helped by several passages in the New Testament. You can see in Matthew, Yeshua saying, hey, do what they tell you to do. And then Paul saying, every person needs to be in subjection to the governing authorities. Some people have interpreted that passage in Romans 13 to say that is explicitly talking about religious authorities and not necessarily civil authorities. But I don't know that I actually believe that interpretation. But then you got in Acts chapter 5, where the Peter and John and a few were gathered together in front of the Sanhedrin, and they said, we gave you strict orders not to continue teaching in this name, and yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching. And they said, we must obey God rather than men. So, this is not an easy thing to do, to figure out, do I follow the civil authorities? Do I follow the religious authorities? You know that it's the religious authorities who got us off track. It is always the religious authorities who have gotten us off track. The Pharisees and the Sadducees got us off track to begin with. When the Gentiles got involved in the church, they took us fully off the track. They said, we don't want anything to do with the authority of the rabbis and the scribes and the Sadducees and the Pharisees. We have no interest in that. They took us fully off the track to where we have no interest in Torah at all now. So I think, unfortunately, this reflects our rebellious attitude that we just don't like authority at all. And you can see Yuvah telling the Hebrews, you have been stiff-necked and rebellious since I met you. Moses said that to them. And I think that we are sons of our fathers. We are still rebellious. We don't know how to judge righteously, a lot of us. I'm not looking at us in particular, but I'm saying just as a religious people, we don't have a real good track record of studying God's word for ourselves to see what it says and being able to, with justice, rebel against our leaders. We have a real bad history of rebelling against authority just in general, just for the sake of rebelling against authority, not righteously. You know what I'm saying? Peter and John standing up to the Sanhedrin and saying, we can't stop talking in the name of Yeshua. We cannot do that.
Which may illustrate the reason why he chose a people that was.
I don't think anyone can hear you. Would you like to speak
I said that
up?
might explain why would he choose a people that was that resistant to authority?
That's a good
because
question.
Because there were plenty of authorities that were going to come along that they needed to resist against. And so I don't think you can say that every time we have resisted against authority, including the American Revolution, that it's been a bad thing. I think that he chose that people because that was the way it was going to go down. These were going to be the people that were going to resist the authorities that had come to be.
Okay.
Now, the problem with choosing that kind of people is they're also going to resist him. And so there's going to be a process that goes on there.
Tracy?
I think, I look at it at the patterns in the scriptures too. Is that we have people like Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Joseph. They're all put under authority, civil authority, and they obey and do, and they rise up and they serve as if they're working for the Lord, as it's written in Colossians. But when it comes, whether or not you have to do something to go against your true ruler, then that's a different story.
Yeah.
So if you want me to wear a mask, okay, I'm going to wear a mask. But if you're going to ask me to bow down and worship your God, we're going to have a problem.
Yeah, good point. And I think that brings me to just a general overall question here. Kevin, go ahead. You muted yourself.
The only other thing to add to that to some degree would be how do we define rebellion? For example, if ultimately our Creator is the only true one and true God, He then should define what real justice is. So ultimately, that's like saying we're rebelling against sin then, right?
Yeah.
If we're rebelling against everything else.
Yeah.
Everything else is not what He's doing.
You see the part that I have underlined here where it says, he's in this section, he's giving prohibitions against making sons and daughters pass through the fire, using divination, practicing witchcraft, interpreting omens, sorcery, casting spells, artists, spiritualists, mediums, calling up the dead. Whoever does these things is detestable to Yehovah, and because of these detestable things, Yehovah your God will drive them out before you. Now, what is interesting to me about that is that it's, people often ask, man, why did God instruct the Israelites to completely decimate the Canaanites living in that land? Whereas he did not say to do those types of things to annihilate completely some of the other peoples who were living around that land. That scripture right there tells you exactly why. It is because of these detestable things that were just delineated that Yehovah is going to drive them out from before you. I mean, you and I, in our day and age, we look at this list of things like, witchcraft and omens and sorcery and stuff like that, and we say, man, we don't really believe in that stuff anymore. We're in the age of enlightenment and reason, and those are some kind of fake spirituality. Those things aren't even real. And I think we can't discount those things just because we live in some kind of enlightened age where we think those things don't exist. I don't think that's reasonable for us to assume. And my second statement on that would be, we need to look at these things overall, and we need to say to ourselves, what do all of these things have in common? Why are these Canaanites pursuing these things? What is it that they're trying to accomplish? And why and then look at those things and say, why is God so angry about those things? That so much so that he's saying these people all must die. They are spreading evil to such a degree that they all must perish. Tracy?
Just looking at it from a spiritual perspective, if you think of this as the type and shadow for what is to come, the true promised land, well, what does he say he's going to do to this earth? That he's going to, all of the wicked will be driven out. They will perish, and then my people will dwell there. So it's, to me, I can kind of look at it that way and see, well, this is what he's teaching us, is that I'm going to cleanse the earth.
Yep. Good insight. I think also it has, when I look at a list like that regarding all of these weird spiritual practices that to us seem a little odd, in our day and age, but, to a degree they're not. What these are is people looking for a way to reach outside of themselves, reach outside of the temporal sphere into the spiritual sphere. They are looking for alternate means of connecting with the metaphysical. God has basically said, if you want to connect with something outside of yourself, it almost seems like, hey, if you want to think that you're God and there are no gods at all, and you just want to live your life and you just want to go along and saying, hey, there are no spiritual powers out there, it's just us, and we were, came out of a soup of, amoeba, I think he would almost rather you believe that. It seems like it to me, because when I look at this list of things, it seems like what really, really angers him is when people try to make spiritual connections with things that are not him in ways that he has not authorized. And so this is what he considers to be such an abomination. And these Canaanites took their cultic worship and their spiritual searching to really perverted levels, and that was, and I wondered to myself, man, that's weird that he would think that these people in particular needed to be exterminated, whereas some of the other people, yeah, they were all idolaters and they were all searching for knowledge of God in some way that was false, but these people seem to have something a little special. They got some special sauce on their God worship that is perverted. So it seemed to me, Kevin, go ahead.
Well, it doesn't sound, this group doesn't sound like they're searching. I think that's the big thing. I don't, like, for example, for, I guess, a number of years now, we've been talking about going green, right? Everybody wants to go green, so we're eating more vegetables. We're looking for things that are organic. And I at one point thought, actually, in that we're now going green, say, as a nation, right? Actually, that could lead toward what happens at the very beginning of everything. And I'm not trying to make too big of a difference. I'm just saying, in that we're going green, a logical jump would be who actually made everything that we're eating and consuming. And a logical jump from there is, wait a minute, there is a God. So I think that the idea of going green could be something that also leads toward, we're searching for something, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
We don't know exactly what it is. We're searching for something. But these folks aren't really searching for anything. They know. They know they're worshiping this whatever, false whatever.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Good point. Well, notice also that God provides the alternative to this. If you look at 18 verse 15, he says, or just before 15, but as for you, Yehovah your God has not allowed you to do these things. Yehovah your God will raise up for you a prophet like me. Now, of course, many people have interpreted this as a reference to Yeshua, and I think that it absolutely is. I think that this is ultimately a foreshadowing picture of Yeshua as the ultimate prophet. But I think we don't need to minimize it. I don't mean minimize it. I mean limit it. Excuse me. That we can also say this is the means by which Yehovah has suggested to us that he will provide us with the answers that we seek if his word is not, fleshed out enough, or we need somebody to give us an actual word for the Lord, from the Lord to provide us some additional information, during certain troubling times or whatever it is. When you're looking for additional information, I have provided for that. It is the prophet. And I think that this is a statement that encompasses all of the prophets. It's not just Moses and Yeshua. It's also everybody in between. That there is a strong historical tradition of Hebrew prophets. And they're all, most of them, a good chunk of them are in your Bible. They're there for a reason. Now, what I have always found fascinating is, and this is kind of interesting, that the prophets are generally just repeating what Moses said. There's not, there are some prognostications regarding what's going to happen in the future, but for the most part, there's not a whole lot of explicit new instruction. It's a reiteration of what Moses had already told them. Maybe they just needed a reminder once in a while, and God sent them a prophet to say, here's what I told you before, and I'm going to tell you the same thing again now. I don't change. I'm not making my mind, different on some subject, but he would give them guidance in specific situations. But I think that's what's, super, super critical there. I'm going to pass forward just a little bit. I'm going to skip this little section that I had about the manslayer and a single witness rising up. I don't think that there's any reason that we should deal with that even further. We've got military service exemptions. And I think here's something interesting, and you can compare verses chapter 20. I've jumped forward just a little bit from to chapter 20, verses 1 through 9, where it's talking about exemptions from service when you go out to battle. And, if you've planted a vineyard and you haven't been able to eat of its fruit, and if you have, been married recently and have not had an opportunity to spend quality time with your wife, so to speak, that you should leave the war front. How you doing over there?
Fine.
You sure? I think if you have seen Steve, I've forgotten his last name. He used to be with 119 Ministries, but he's got this interesting teaching regarding Yeshua needing to, come to the earth and spend 1 year with his people before going to battle based on this. Mutria, yes, thank you. Steve Mutria had this idea regarding, because of this verse here where it talks about, don't go out to battle until you've had a year to spend with your wife, which I think he's got some interesting ideas there, because it's talking about that in Exodus when the people of Israel kind of like married God, under the chuppah of the Mount Sinai and pledged, I do, and he said you will, and we will, and it was like definitely those images of a marriage covenant going on there. And then they seem to have spent 1 year hanging around Mount Sinai, which I think is fascinating, and it reflects exactly what is going on with this section here, telling us that a man who has recently taken a bride should spend 1 year with her before going out to battle, so that he doesn't die in battle and somebody else take her.
And this, especially this thing where the vineyard and hasn't begun to use its fruit, because didn't he say something specific about I won't drink this cup until?
He did say,
right when he was saying I go to prepare a house for you, and then here we have as a house but not dedicated it.
Yes, I think that's why Steve Mutria has brought these things up, and so he has posited a theory that Yeshua will show up on the scene here and kind of like have a mini rapture where he'll take the believers to some place on the earth and spend 1 year with them there. I think he proposes it's actually Sinai itself, and then he will go to battle to destroy his enemies.
And he specifically says, don't seek me. If you were supposed to be there, you would have been.
I think
so don't go. If they say I'm out here, don't go there. If they say I'm out, just stay where you are, because I have who I need with me.
Yes. Whoever just posted that notice, that is correct. Yeah, the 1 year tribulation and the return of Yeshua. Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's quite fascinating. I don't know. Tracy just put a link in the chat if you want to check that out. It's quite fascinating. I don't know whether it's entirely good and accurate or whatever. He does make some good points. He's a really smart guy. Some interesting things to consider for sure. But you should check that out if you get an opportunity. It's quite fascinating. Interesting thing regarding, and I'm just going to kind of go through my notes here because my head is pounding and I'm ready to stop. The fruit-bearing trees in verses 19 through 20. Notice that I'm confident that you can bring a pretty neat spiritual idea out of this. If you're looking at 19 and 20, whenever you besiege a city, you cannot destroy the trees, especially the ones who bear fruit.
By swinging an axe.
By swinging where an axe is laid to the root of the trees?
That.
Yes, that's
okay.
John the Baptist talking to the Pharisees.
Okay.
But I would say that's a fascinating section that you should take a look at, because it's talking about, if it's a fruit-bearing tree, you may not chop it down to besiege your enemies. But if it is a non-fruit-bearing tree, then you may chop it down and build siege works against your enemies.
What if it's a fruit tree that's not bearing fruit?
What if it's a fruit tree that's not bearing fruit? Then I suppose you could chop it down.
Supposed to I think that was the one that was supposed to have the axe.
Certainly.
Okay.
So that's just an interesting thing, and I think you could dig a little deeper there and probably find some interesting things. In chapter 21, we've got the law of unsolved murder. I think we should reinstitute that law in modern America. That'd be fantastic. Every time someone is killed and we don't know who did it, we bring all the city mayors out to do some kind of ritual over the dead body and wash their hands and say, "We don't know who did this." I think that might get them serious.
Be a press opportunity.
What'd you say?
Nothing.
A press opportunity. I don't think they would want that press opportunity. That's what I'm saying.
I'm sure they would find a way to make.
You think they would find a way to spin it?
Lemons, yes.
I'm saying if you put them on camera every time somebody died, and they'd have to wash their hands over the neck of the blood of a bull.
Stop.
She hates it when I talk about politics. I understand, and I apologize, ladies and gentlemen. Please forgive me. I want to take a look at this. I do want to spend a moment on, and that is verse 21, chapter 21, verse 10. Chapter 21, verse 10. This is quite fascinating. You know, it's interesting because here it says when you go, and this is the very beginning of the next Torah portion, which is what we're dealing with here, which is Ke Teitzei. It says, when you go out to battle against your enemies and Yehovah your God delivers them into your hands and you take them away captive and see among the captives a beautiful woman and have a desire for her and would take her as a wife for yourself, ... It continues on from there. If you take a look at the Hebrew there in verse 10, it's kind of interesting, and it reminded me of something else. It basically says, when you go out to war against your enemies and you have delivered the Lord thy God into their hands, and you have taken, it says, vishavita shivyo. It's the same word. When you have taken captivity captive. Does that phrase ring a bell with you? It does to me too. And that is, I forgot to put the stupid. No, I did not forget to put the stupid. Psalm 68:18. Make a note to yourself, and Ephesians 4:8, which is Paul quoting Psalm 68, and talking about taking captivity captive. Now, I think what's interesting here, and Paul is taking this, I know that you guys have often heard of this Hebrew exegetical method called Pardes, which is the Hebrew for paradise with the PRD, PRDS for sowed. But if you look at this passage, it seems on the surface level, which would be the P, which is Parshat, Parsha, how to treat a captive woman. If you go out to battle against your enemies and your eye happens to see a beautiful woman and you desire to marry her, it's got some series of steps that you're supposed to take if you decide you want to take her for your wife. And on the surface level, that's real basic. Here's the way you're supposed to do that. But then when you go down to the remez level, you might think about, and this is where it says this is hinting at something deeper, I think you might look at how to deal with other types of captivity. Other captives or other types of captivity. Somebody else mentioned this when it was Paul mentioned previously in one other section, taking every thought captive. That there was maybe an application there. Where have we heard this before? Taking it to the next level. Where have we heard of this before? And this is where you begin to connect Psalm 68:18 and Ephesians 4:8, where taking captivity captive, is where you can kind of take it to that deeper level.
What was he talking about?
Who?
In Psalm.
In Psalm. That is interesting because in Psalm 68:18 it seems to be that Yehovah is talking about, or through the prophet David is saying he's relating how they left Egypt, and he's saying that he took captivity captive. And I think that many interpreters have said what is actually happening there is that God is taking the servants away from Pharaoh and saying, these are mine. These are not your servants.
Taking
they never
captives and making them his captives?
Yes, it's basically a transfer of authority. They were his servants to begin with, and Pharaoh stole them.
Okay, so what is Ephesians about?
Ephesians is Paul taking that to the next level and saying the enemy, Hasatan, has taken captives of God's people, and Yeshua is on a rescue mission taking captives captivity, taking the captives captive again. Okay. So it's interesting because when we looked at the book of Exodus, and we were studying the removal of the people from Egypt, that we saw that being like a metaphorical picture of Pharaoh being like the adversary.
Well, Tracy pointed out the thing with the strongman's house, I think it
Yes,
was. I don't
yes.
know if she's there.
Yeah. So I just think that was an interesting way to look at this passage where you can see that you can take this levels of Scripture and dig down a little bit deeper, and you can see Paul did that for us. In fact, it's quite interesting that in several instances, Paul did that in this Torah portion. There was another one coming up later where it says, you shall not yoke or muzzle an ox when it's treading out the grain. And in 1 Corinthians, he picks that up and points it out and says, do you think God was concerned about oxen? He's telling you, and that's the reason that I brought this up is because I think that we can real easily look at especially this Torah portion. This Torah portion right here, Ke Teitzei, has more commandments in it than any other Torah portion. Of the 613 commandments, this one has the most. But we often can look at these and say, I don't know how I would make this apply to me. You look at this thing we just looked at and say, oh, this is about somebody going out to battle and capturing a woman and taking her into your house and going through this elaborate ritual so that you can marry her. This doesn't really apply to me. And I think we often struggle with that when we are looking at, how do I make this work for me? Because there are so many different things in this that it's historically far off that we don't exactly know how it would apply to us. And we have a hard time sometimes extrapolating the principle so that we can see how it might apply.
You were listening to something yesterday, I think, where she was taking and chunking these together, and the one I remembered was if you look at the commandments that are strung together from 22:9 to and on from there, that it's about this. You got not sowing your vineyard with two kinds of seed.
Oh yeah.
Not plowing with an ox and a donkey yoked together.
Yep.
Not wearing a material of mixed wool and linen.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes to the taking a wife and turning against her. And that she was saying that the theme there is how you pair things. It's not that one is bad and one is good and you're putting them together like what we've been talking about with mixing. It's that you just don't put those things together. They can both be good on their own. You just don't put them together.
And we don't understand necessarily why that is, but there's a reason, obviously. But, I agree with you, and that's a good insight. I just say, that's the challenge for us always, is to look at these commandments just like Paul did, and he says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. How can we make that work for us? And if you look at 1 Corinthians 9, you'll see how Paul made it work for us. Because Paul, interpreting it, said God was not concerned about oxen, although he is concerned about oxen. I mean, he loves all of his creatures.
Peshat, yeah.
That's the Peshat level. That's what you shall not do, is muzzle an ox. But he is telling us, Paul is, you've got to look at these things with spiritual eyes and just think about it for a moment and talk about it amongst yourselves and say, how does this apply to me in this day and age?
I think that how they're grouped in here can offer clues, because you look at how they're grouped and they don't seem related. It just seems like he's skipping from one thing to another.
Yeah.
But if you can find the thread that binds them all together, then you might understand really what he was, the bigger, like what Paul was doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm gonna just end right there.
Okay.
Because there's a lot more, and I got 4 pages of stuff here, but I can't cover it all tonight. I'm just tired. I'm gonna take a break. I'm gonna go lay down and relax.